Hey, it's BAO, and this is Coffee with BAO, where I chat with awesome people about their creative process, their cultural identity, and how they continue to grow as a human being. And I've had such awesome guests on this show. You can find them all and get in touch with me on my website, coffeewithbao.com. You guys, I'm hanging out with somebody very exceptional today. She is a fellow child of the refugee camp. She's a Vietnamese American infectious disease specialist and an author. She's been working to fight against HIV/AIDS for several years, and during the pandemic, she's been working with COVID-19 patients. And somehow she's found time to publish her debut children's book called Coronavirus is Boo Boo. So here's my friend and lab coat model, Dr. Cate Le. What's up, Cate?
Thanks for having me, Bao.
I expected you to wear your lab coat to the
oh, really?
coffee chat.
Gosh, I try never to wear my lab coat outside of the hospital.
Do you actually have to wear that at work?
Oh, yeah. Well, okay, it's funny because as infectious disease doctors, we don't really like wearing what we call fomites, things that can transfer, bacteria or viruses from one room to the other. But as a very small Asian female, I feel if I don't wear my coat, even when I wear my coat, I'm the dietitian, I'm the nurse, I'm the pharmacist, I'm never the MD. So I got to do what I can.
Wow, interesting. Well, cool. No lab coat, but thank you for making it here. We're matching with the black shirts today.
Oh, yeah.
Cheers to you.
Cheers.
From 11 miles away in, I guess, still Los Angeles, right?
Yeah, is it really 11 miles away?
I think so. You grew up in the Midwest, I read. I didn't realize, but you mentioned earlier that Minnesota actually has a pretty big, immigrant population for some reason. Is that where they just settled a lot of immigrants from certain programs?
I wanted to say that. I think it's one of those places that had a lot of government support for immigrant programs. But we were actually sponsored by a religious family. So I'm not sure if those are necessarily tied together, but yeah, it's a huge immigrant hub. We actually have one of the biggest Somali populations outside of Somalia. I think the biggest. But also a lot of Southeast Asians. Yeah, Southeast Asians, East Africans, Eastern Europeans. So
cool.
It wasn't as white bread and butter growing.
As most people would think.
As people would think. But it is as cold as people would think. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about that. You were born in a refugee camp. I was at a refugee camp for a portion of my very young life too, but I was in the Philippines.
Oh, so are we.
Cool.
Yeah. In Bataan?
I think in Manila.
Okay.
Yeah. So tell me, I guess, about your family's refugee journey.
Yeah. I really can't. I was a baby when I came to the U.S. And so I don't know about you, but I obviously don't remember any of it. You just see pictures.
Same.
I think really, it is really a testament to immigrant stories and the kind of things that they endure that seem just crazy when you look back at it and when you hear stories about it. And I don't know about your parents, but my family almost never talks about it. I always say that because I feel like it keeps me really grounded. And I think it is a huge part as to what motivates me through life is, making your family proud and they just sacrifice so much for you to have a better life. And so, I actually do. I think about it a lot, even though I don't remember any of it. But
what have you learned so far about that journey and how your family initiated that whole process?
Yeah. So it's interesting because both of my grandparents worked for the U.S. My grandfather actually worked directly for the U.S. Army, and my grandmother worked for a private U.S. company. And so right after the fall of Saigon, he had gotten all of his paperwork for us to leave the city and come to the U.S. But my grandma tells a story of how they were, I think he had gone for the day for some reason, and she was at home. She had all the papers, and Viet Cong soldiers were like knocking door to door and looking for people who had ties so that they could take them to re-education camp, and basically freaked out and burned everything like immediately.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's why our family didn't actually leave until 10 years later. So in 1985. And that was right before the markets opened up in Vietnam. So things were really, really bad. It was really hard to find food. So they really left during the worst of it and ended up going through my grandma's connections with her private U.S. company. And that's how we got sponsored and all of that. So, you know, as I'm told, we only had like a week, and they got all their stuff together and basically just left. And then my mom actually found out she was pregnant once she got to the refugee camp.
Dang.
You know, testing to make sure that you don't have any other, you know, medical issues. So yeah, so I was there and born there, and then I came here when I was a month or so.
Wow, that's so...
How about you?
We actually came in 1985 also.
Oh, really?
But I was born in Vietnam. I came to the refugee camp as a very young toddler, and so I don't remember anything either. And it's super similar because my mom also worked for like a military logistics company, but it was like a private firm.
Yeah.
So they resettle you in Minnesota because that was where your sponsors were.
Yep.
It's cold as shit in Minnesota.
Yeah.
How did your parents kind of like adapt to that?
I have no idea, because we got here in, I want to say March, April, and in Minnesota that's still winter. So winter is like legit at least 6 months there. So their pictures of when they first came is like they're all bundled up, and it's like, you know, 2 feet of snow outside. Yeah. And, you know, coming from a tropical country, I have no idea how they did it. And sometimes I ask them, they're just like, yeah, it's just really cold. I guess, I mean, it was probably a step up from the refugee camps, I can only imagine. But it's funny because now they've been there for, you know, 30-something years, and they're so used to it. They go anywhere else, and they're like, it's too hot. We just want to go to Minnesota. Yeah, so... but with global warming, I will say it's not as cold as when I was growing up there. We definitely get way less snowstorms. So a little bit different, but it's still pretty cold.
I know that for us as a first-generation immigrant family, we did a lot of Vietnamese things to try to hang on to our culture. Like, did you guys have certain things that you remember that were like emblematic of preserving the culture?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure your family is the same way, but obviously we're very, very food centered. And I'm really lucky because everybody in my family are amazing cooks, both the men and the women. And so, you know, I remember growing up and we didn't have a table. So we would put like a big picnic blanket on the living room floor, and all the food would be on the floor, and we would just sit around and eat. And so I think a lot of my connections to my culture are really based around food. And when I go home, you know, Terrence was with me and my partner, and he was like, you guys eat breakfast, and then literally you're talking about what you're going to eat for lunch. And I was like, yeah. So definitely food. But then we were also, I was raised Buddhist. My whole mother's side of the family is Buddhist. And, we celebrated all of like the death anniversaries, obviously, you know, Vietnamese New Year. And yeah, I think I remember most the death anniversary celebrations, which is, you know, a lot of basically you're celebrating your ancestors, and you are making food, of course, so that they have it in their afterlife. And you do that on the day of their death on the lunar calendar every year. So there's several of those throughout the year. And it always seemed like it was a fun, you know, family get together, and everybody would just sit around and talk and eat. So yeah, I think a lot of those types of traditions.
Cool. So I have this question, but there's two different ways to ask it. I'm going to ask it both ways. What kind of foods did you guys grow up making at home? which also could be asked, like, what part of Vietnam were you guys from?
Oh, yeah. So we're from the South. My family grew up there right outside of Saigon in a little suburb, I guess you could call it. The stuff that you get at the restaurants, were really more like special occasion kind of things. It was really what I call like peasant food.
Yeah, totally.
I forgot what the Vietnamese term for that is, but always rice, always some sort of gan or like soup dish, and then some sort of meat dish, and maybe like a vegetable dish. But I think I didn't even realize how different the cuisines are in different regions until I actually went back to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I was actually working in a hospital in Hanoi for a couple of months, and the food is very different. So good.
Right?
So good, but yeah, so I'm from the South. Your family's from the South too, I assume.
Yeah, we're from Dalat, kind of in the mountains.
Yeah.
So growing up in Minnesota, was your group of friends pretty diverse in terms of ethnic backgrounds? Yeah,
I think, kind of looking back on it, I always had kind of two groups of friends, which is kind of interesting. And I think a reflection a little bit of class and education. But there were the friends that I, hung out with outside of school, which were all either kind of lower class white skaters or ethnic people, a lot of Cambodians, some Vietnamese, a lot of Hmong people, and some Somalians. And then there were my friends at school, which I would hang out with when we had like school projects, but I was in all the honors classes. And so everybody was white.
Yeah.
And there was just a huge distinction, like I never really talked to my white friends about like what I did after school with like my other.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's interesting. And it kind of sucked that there was that kind of distinction. And, we kind of talked about it earlier, but there's a huge distinction between Southeast Asians and their experience in the U.S. or even in their home country, obviously, versus, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans.
Yeah.
And there were very few of them, or at least that I knew of when I was growing up in Minnesota. So, there were a couple of Chinese people in my honors classes, but we just didn't really connect, even though we were Asian in a sea of white people. Like our experiences are just so different as Asians in the U.S. that I really didn't identify with them.
Well, I feel like it's different for us Southeast Asians versus the experience of East Asians. For a lot of other people on the outside, it's like we're all just Asian people.
Yeah.
I mean, had there been any experiences that you can remember where you like that came in stark relief?
Oh yeah. I mean, even today, like I think especially with all the kind of recent, headlines about hate crimes against Asians and stuff, it's been kind of something that I've had to like talk about a lot, but I think it's been a really interesting time. Because even Terrence, my partner, who is Black, at one point had said to me, Asians don't really get discriminated against. Or you have like, I forgot exactly what he said. I'm so mad about it. But, it's that concept of a model minority.
Yeah.
Right. And I think what it comes down to is this idea that there are good and bad stereotypes.
Yeah.
But there's really not. And, when people talk about Asian people as a whole group, I don't think they realize that they're lumping people who are from completely different countries with at times very different cultures, and whose experiences in America are extremely different. You and I came from refugee camps and often, grew up on welfare, and that was just in the 1980s, right? We're still relatively young. Whereas I have friends who, my Chinese and Japanese friends have been here for generations. Some of them don't even speak, their native family language. And I think a couple experiences, I remember one time I was invited to a Thanksgiving dinner with a friend of mine who is Cantonese, and her dad is a really bright medical engineer kind of guy. He went to Caltech, and they were sitting and talking about like science and politics over dinner. And I was just like in awe because I could never imagine having that type of conversation with my family.
Yeah.
Not only is there that like language barrier, like I do speak Vietnamese, but I don't know a lot of, very technical terms. But also my family is doesn't have that level of education. And part of that is because they came here with like literally nothing. So I think even that kind of experience was really new for me. But yeah, I think really with the headlines lately, it's been interesting to have kind of the discussions about, the model minority stereotype and how, I remember when there was all those shootings in Atlanta. And actually somebody at work was like, so what's your take on, people saying this is not a hate crime because it was sexually driven. The motive was, like a sex addiction. I mean, whatever.
Yeah.
But my response was, well, the fact that you can have somebody murder a bunch of people based on the fact that he saw an entire race of women as sexual, as subjects, that if that doesn't explain colonialism and imperialism and like white supremacy to a T, then I don't know what is. So, that's
man, I'm so glad we're talking about this. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm very glad that I'm in California, to be honest. I love that I have a daughter that's going to be able to be, she's going to grow up and see all different kinds of people. I think looking back, I didn't realize kind of that type of struggle that you deal with internally when you're around a bunch of people who don't look like you.
Yeah.
And inadvertently or on purpose, people are going to say things to you about your culture. And as a kid, you just want to fit in no matter what, no matter where you come from. I think as a kid, you don't like to feel singled out because of something, and you don't learn to really be proud of your heritage until you're older. And I think that's natural. So yeah. I'm really happy to raise a family in California for sure.
You are a doctor, but you're also a very creative person, obviously. I mean, growing up, were you like an art kid? How did you discover your passion for both like wanting to go into medicine, but also like being a creative person?
Yeah, I think I've always been really lucky and blessed that way. I've always been very like right and left brained. My mom, there's a lot of people in my family who are very artistic. Several of my uncles, painted and do all this stuff. So I think I was always exposed. My mother loves music. She plays guitar. She sings. And so and I'm an only child. So I think I grew up playing by myself a lot. And a lot of it was just like sitting and drawing and reading. So I think that side of me was always nurtured, but I think I'm also very left-brained in that I've always liked the sciences. I've always been good at it. But it wasn't until much later, I think, that I was like, okay, I want to do medicine. I had entertained other non-science field. I thought about like architecture school, which kind of marries both worlds, I think, in some ways. Yeah. But for me, I think maybe it's that like immigrant drive where I don't think my mom is very supportive. I don't know if the rest of my family would have been very happy if I was like, I'm going to go be an artist, I'm sure you know the struggle. So I think just from a sustainability, I want to be able to take care of my family, financially. I wanted to find something that was, I guess, more traditional and reliable in that sense. And I definitely didn't grow up with a mom that made me, have to be like either a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. She was always really supportive, but I'm lucky in that I do love medicine and I love taking care of people, but I also love the science behind it. So yeah, but I still try to find some time to be creative and read. I still try to read a lot. But it's like my hobby. It's the way that I wind down. I'm not a person that just likes to sit and veg out and watch TV. I get really antsy. Terrence always says that like I just don't know how to relax. But it's like my way of relaxing is really, to do some type of art or so luckily for me that made me productive in other ways.
Yeah, totally. You studied medicine in St. Louis at Washington University School of Medicine. And then how did you end up in California at Cedars-Sinai?
Yeah. So, how when you look back at your life and you kind of see like why decisions led to other decisions?
Wow.
To me, at that time, it didn't really feel like that. So I think looking back on it, when I left Minnesota and got into WashU, which is a really prestigious school, med school is a really hard time for me. I felt really out of place. It was a lot of other students who, came from families of doctors or, just like a really different background than me. And I could never really figure out why I felt so uncomfortable. It really wasn't until I did my residency in Tennessee. So I was in the South. I don't know how I ended up there. But, racial issues in the South, it kind of doesn't get clearer than that. And even Nashville, which is pretty liberal for the South, is still the South. And my experiences in residency were, dealing with a lot of racism towards me. My primary clinic was at a VA. And so all of my patients who were vets, many of them were so lovely. And even a lot of them who, would say some things to me, I think a lot of them were dealing with PTSD from the Vietnam War, etc. Things would come up. And so that was a very interesting experience. I got called a couple of racial slurs before that I hadn't even heard since I was in elementary school when kids were being kids. And then my Black friends in residency, they'd go into a patient's room with their white coat and everything, and the patient would be like, "Oh, well, the trash is over there." They would just assume that they were custodial staff or assume that they were transport. So I think it was kind of during that time where I realized, kind of looking back at my med school days, why it was just so uncomfortable for me. And, I really grew passionate about equality issues and racial justice. And then, it translates into health inequities as well. For patients. And so leaving Nashville, I just really wanted to be in a place where there was a lot more diversity. So I really only looked at big cities on the coast and ended up in LA.
Cool. When did your time in Hanoi fit into this timeline?
That was in late medical school. So again, because WashU is it's a great school. It's a very well-funded school. I was able to get funding to go abroad. So I did a couple things. I was in East Africa and Uganda for a little bit. And then my last year, I spent quite a bit of time in Southeast Asia. I worked at a hospital in Hanoi for a month in an HIV clinic there. And learned a lot, so it was great. And I got to, that was the first time I'd actually ever been to Vietnam. So it was really amazing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's an interesting context for returning to your
motherland. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Wow. Interesting. So you specialize in HIV/AIDS, And then you had to work during the pandemic on COVID patients, basically. How would you summarize like that experience before and during pandemic?
Yeah.
Like, how did your work change and how did your life change?
Yeah. So, I when I specialize in HIV/AIDS, it's really more that's what all my research has been in.
Mm-hmm.
But my training as a clinical physician is just in infectious diseases in general. So we deal with all types of infections, all different viruses, et cetera. And really, I mean, we were kind of trained for epidemics and pandemics, right?
Wow.
In the sense that we knew that it was coming at some point. And we see it kind of every year in much smaller scale, obviously, with the flu and Ebola and SARS.
Yeah.
Even though I think for most people in the U.S. that seems very distant. It's something that we, I think, as a profession are much more attuned to. So, when the pandemic started, I think that we did underestimate. To be totally honest, we did kind of underestimate, I think, the level of preparedness or lack of preparedness of the U.S. And I think that kind of set us up for everything else. I don't think that we thought it was going to be so quick to just explode, basically.
Yeah.
It was in China. We were like, we thought it'd be more like SARS, I think.
Right, like bird flu. It went away.
Yeah, exactly.
After a while.
But I work with some older colleagues who say that they basically had kind of PTSD type of symptoms from the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Wow.
Where you had this virus that was just ravaging communities and people were dying and you didn't have anything to do other than just kind of support them.
And the government was kind of like turning a blind eye for so long.
Exactly. And there's a little bit of that like conspiracy, flavor in there a little bit too. And I get it. There were, at the height of it here in LA back in December, January, February, every patient I had COVID. You would just watch them die, a lot of them. The hospital was so low on supplies and rooms. I remember we have these, they're called PACU units, where it's like post-op patients that are just kind of recovering. And so it's like kind of a big open bay. And we converted all of them into ICUs, into open bay intensive care units. So nowadays, when you go into an ICU, every patient has their own room, which obviously is going to be more sterile. There's all these glass everywhere. But during these times, it was completely open. And it literally reminded me of my experience in these third world countries, where you just had a curtain, if you were lucky, separating all these patients who were, all intubated on ventilators. And I mean, it was really, really crazy. So I think even kind of expecting that and even having some experience in settings like that, I never thought I would see that in the US. I thought that if I had ever had to deal with some type of epidemic, it would be me volunteering in like Liberia for an like Ebola outbreak. So yeah, it's been really interesting.
Well, I'm sure a lot of everybody watching will say thank you for just being in that position.
Yes. Well, I mean, it was I don't know if I really had too much of a choice, but I'm happy to do it, obviously.
Somehow, throughout all this time, you found the time to write and illustrate your first children's book to teach young children about coronavirus. And can you give us your elevator pitch for Coronavirus is Boo Boo?
You think that being in LA for however many years, I would be better at elevator pitches. But I'm really not. But basically, I think being a mom and a working mom and having a lot of friends who are physicians and working moms, we were really kind of worried about what our kids were experiencing. And I think that worry continues. I'm a new mom. I only have a 2-year-old, and so I don't know what it's like to have anybody that's older, but seeing my kid kind of having to deal with masks and having to wear a mask all the time, I was like, man, what must she be thinking? And she's not seeing her family anymore, you know?
Yeah, she can't give hugs and all that.
Yeah, just what a different reality that is. And we worry about their social development, right? It's so important kind of in those early years. And I think another component of it was the misinformation that's going around, which we've just never really seen before. I really wanted to find a way to put out information, education for kind of that age group in a way that was really approachable, but also honest, which I think kinds of ended up being a little bit difficult. And to also kind of touch on things like social inequalities that are just part of the fabric of our world and were made very, very apparent by the pandemic. And I don't think you can have an honest conversation with anyone of any age about coronavirus and its like real impact without really talking about those things. And I think that you can talk about that to a toddler. I think that they can actually kind of understand those things, right? We know that babies can tell race apart basically based on what they're exposed to. So yeah, and I found that a lot of the books that were out there, they weren't really for me. They weren't what I was looking for because they tended to be a little bit too high level. I think they're probably more geared to like first, second graders. And so, yeah, I was like, why don't I just write something? And a friend of mine, she's a family medicine doctor, but specializes in HIV, really helped cheer me through it and kind of gave me a lot of feedback and a lot of ideas. And so, yeah, it was a fun experience. It was something that I would just go home and doodle and stuff. So part of it was relaxing for me. I think once the book actually like got done and I had to go through the technical, you know, the logistical process of getting it published and into this, like a book format, that's when things got really stressful.
Right. Yeah, I see.
Yeah, because it wasn't particularly fun at that time. I was busy, and it was just a whole learning curve, really.
Right. I'm gonna show an image of your book and tell people where to find it.
Awesome.
Dr. Cate Le's debut children's book is called Coronavirus is Boo Boo, and it helps kids understand the virus, and it explains basic stuff like why everyone's wearing masks. But it also touches on really important themes such as racial inequality, health inequalities, and the importance of being vaccinated. You can find Cate at catelemd.com, and you can find her book at coronavirusisbooboo.com. What age range do you think is appropriate for your book?
I would say between 1 to 7 or 8.
That's awesome.
But I have friends who have older kids that have really enjoyed it too, because I think you can get more out. You can get, you know, really basic information out of it. But like you said, I think that there are some nuances there that kids who are a little bit older can appreciate as well. It rhymes. That is Terrence's doing, because he says he hates children's books that don't rhyme.
That's awesome.
So that was his suggestion, and I think kids like that as well.
And so, the illustrations are beautiful. I must say, when I was talking to a friend about this conversation before it happened, I was like, yo, she's a doctor. I don't know how she did this thing. Because it looks good. You know, it's like, it's legit. How do you feel like, I don't know because I don't have a child, and how do you feel like people trying to raise a young child at this time, like what do you think their biggest challenge would be?
Man, there's so much. I think in a lot of ways I'm really lucky because my kid is younger than the age of like daycare and school. I think kids who are in grade school, even up to like senior year, your social life is so important that having to basically like cut that out completely is crazy. The psychological impact that, I mean, I've even seen in just adults. I can't even imagine in you know, teenagers and younger, and even really into early college, right? Like your frontal lobe is not developed, and the impact that has, that type of isolation has on somebody is long lasting. So I think parents of kids through that whole age range, I think that's their primary concern, to be honest. You know, we are very lucky that young people who are oftentimes going to be otherwise healthy, if they get coronavirus, you know, for the most part, everybody's going to be fine. And it's very mild disease. So I think at this point, you start to worry less about their physical illness if they were to get sick, and more about their mental illness.
Yeah, their developments.
Exactly. And I think the other part that doesn't really get talked about is the impact on working families. So, you know, if you're relying on school to be, you know, your sort of daycare for your kid, and that is constantly, it's not even that. I think if it were just 100% shut down this entire time, it would have been easier to deal with than kind of the on and off again, and a lot of the unknowns, where I have, you know, kids still get like sniffles all the time and they have coughs all the time, right? Like that's normal for them, and it's not always COVID. But you know, I've had colleagues where they would go to drop off their kid at school, and these are like nurses, physicians, people with jobs where it's not, they can't work from home, first of all. And at the door of the school, they're not able to drop their kid off because, you know, Johnny has a sniffle. And then they're left with, okay, you have to make all these last minute plans. And that's just something that's happening like weekly.
Wow.
So it's really, really hard. So it's just disruptive all around. And I do think that there's going to be some long lasting impacts that we'll have to deal with as a society for sure.
Yeah. You said earlier that some of the new skills that you learn while putting this book out into the world included like the publishing part and the distribution and all of that. Was that kind of like the biggest challenge to getting this thing done?
Yeah, I think so. There definitely, there were early on, there's the challenges of like, I just sat down and started drawing this book. A creative challenge. Yeah, exactly. I just started creating. I didn't really think about like the formatting and like, you know, how, you know, the quality of the however many pixels. See, I don't even know. Like the resolution. That's what I'm trying to do. I didn't worry about those things. And so honestly, the first draft, it looked terrible. And I had to go back and literally do the entire thing over in the appropriate resolution, just because, I mean, it just wasn't something that I thought about. And then, so that there are some logistical parts, you know, being somebody where this is definitely not my day job, was a bit of a learning curve and really like slowed things down a lot. To be honest, I think the part that is really difficult for me has really been the kind of sales part of it. So I'm not, and I don't know if this is my Asian background or that you're not a self-promoter, right? I'm not a self-promoter. I'm from the Midwest. I don't like talking about myself. I didn't do it to like make money. You know what I mean? That's the thing, is like, it's really more of like a passion project, right? And so I think for Terrence, who is kind of functioning as my business guy and marketing extraordinaire, etc., it's been really frustrating for him. I'm not really like a social media person. I don't like, it's just, it's not in my nature. And I think part of growing your business and your brand, that's a huge part of it.
Well, you're also saving everybody's lives right now.
Honestly, that was the other thing is some of this was during, you know, the height of the pandemic. And, you know, Terrence would say, well, we really need to like write some articles or think of some social media posts. And I'm like, I would get home at the end of the day and I'm like, I just had half of my patients die. Like, I just really don't want to do this. And so, yeah, you're right. I kind of blocked that part out. That is a huge part of it. Yeah. And actually, during all this time, I was also starting our post-COVID clinic at Cedars-Sinai. And that's been a whole thing as well, and a learning experience in and of itself. It's hard to keep something that was supposed to be, I think, very relaxing for me to make it into like a day job almost. That transition is still really hard for me, to be totally honest.
Yeah. Did you learn anything else that you like didn't expect to learn in this process? Yeah,
Amazon is a beast. They are not small business friendly. I will tell you that. And I think it's really given me a new appreciation for small business owners, for sure. Because it's not even that we're trying to make a profit. Like, that's not even the issue. It's more like you're just trying to decrease your losses. I can't even say break even. Right? And when you have businesses that are able to provide the same service, but you have to take 50% cut. I don't think people realize that when you buy something from Amazon, the seller could be making literally cents on the product. So yeah, it's really, I think it's made me rethink capitalism.
Sheesh. Well, I'm glad we get to come on and talk about this project and share it with more people. Let me just remind people where to find your book. Dr. Cate Le's children's book, Coronavirus is Boo Boo, is available, I guess, on Amazon, a bunch of other online resellers. Cate wrote and illustrated this book herself, as well as self-publishing it. Super gnarly because she's a doctor working on corona patients. You can find her book online, and I'd really love to see some big publisher come in and pick this up and distribute it all over the world. It's so valuable of content for that age group. So if you know anybody, hit me up. Find Cate Le at catelemd.com and buy her book at coronavirusisbooboo.com. So in addition to Coronavirus is Boo Boo, some of your online writing really reinforces it really shows that you are super passionate about racial and health and social equality within the health and medicine sphere. And I have to admit, I'm not really educated on that. And how would you summarize like maybe the top 2 or 3 issues that we need to work on?
I think the way that I would think about it is, one, to answer your question as a physician to other physicians, is I think as medicine and healthcare providers, we very much assume a position of altruism, right? I think most people who go into medicine go into it because they care about people and they want to help people. And so the idea that there can be any type of prejudice or racial bias or any other type of bias from a physician toward a patient is often met with a lot of, well, I know I don't do that. Other people must do it because, we see the numbers, right? We see the numbers where, Black mothers, their mortality rate in labor and delivery is extraordinarily higher than women of other races, specifically white women. But we don't really see that as a direct result of anything that physicians do. We only think of it as a systems issue, and part of it is. But I think it's really hard to deny that people still make up systems, right? And there are things that as a physician, you can start to think about. White privilege is something that permeates everything. And then also just things like implicit bias is something that is evolutionary. it's something that is developed because you need it. It helped people survive, right? Like you make snap judgments. And just because we have now evolved into a society doesn't mean that those things just go away. And the best of us are going to have biases about people. And so just even, I think, coming to terms with that and understanding that, and even if you are, nobody's saying that you're a racist, but you have some biases that are based on race probably, and it's okay to acknowledge that, and that really is kind of the first step. And I think a lot of physicians or other people in these altruistic fields kind of bypass that step, and I think it's such a necessary step. And I think, you know, the piece that you're talking about that I wrote, really, that's what I was trying to portray. Because you hear a lot of physicians, you know, go to the bat about trying to provide better access to healthcare for certain communities and things like that. But it's like, hey, homie, like, let's first take a look at yourself. Anyhow, that's how I would answer, I think, the biggest problem from my standpoint. And I can't even say biggest, but I think the first problem to address that is easy to address from an individual level as somebody in the field.
What about for normies like me?
Yeah.
Like what can we do?
I mean, I think it's a similar concept, right? I think of everything through a healthcare lens, but, you know, I have conversations every day with my friends about privilege and implicit bias, and it's still sometimes so hard. And it's just like, sometimes it's like little things where after the Atlanta shootings, I had a lot of my white friends reach out to me and text me, and they're just like, oh, I just wanted to let you know I'm thinking about you. And I think I remember my first response was like, man, this is what Black people felt like all of like 2020, 2019, right?
Yeah.
Like with George Floyd, it's just like this burden that people put on you to like, I just never really knew how to respond to those kinds of messages, you know? You're just like, okay, so like, am I supposed to be like, thank you, like for thinking of me? Or, so I think there's a lot that even the most well-intentioned people have to learn about how to navigate this. And it's not easy. And I would say that I think maybe the most important and basic step is like, be uncomfortable. I think it's time for white people to be uncomfortable. I'm not going to lie. I think that the narrative has always been in a way to explain things to them in a way that makes them not so uncomfortable that they withdraw. But I feel like we're just kind of past that. And so I think that would be my biggest thing. And it's what I tell my white friends, to be honest.
Yeah.
You know, but maybe that's too blunt. What do you think?
You know, I think that I guess I have one point to make, is that we could try harder not to become instantly enraged, and we should maybe have some patience to engage and try, like all of us, right? To try to allow people to have an opportunity to understand better. Because a lot of us have that gut emotion where like, what you just did is so offensive, blah, blah, blah. Like, sometimes, like, let's hash this out. Let's see what we can do. But sometimes it's like, yeah.
Here's the problem with that, is that that's always been the argument, right? Is like, you can never be the angry Black person.
Sure.
It doesn't take much to have that label. And I think, and I'm not saying that when white people are trying, that you don't make room for that. But I also think that needs to also come from the other side, where it's, especially right now, things are really emotional and very raw. And there's been a lot of things that have happened that I think are really hurtful to these communities. And I think my advice would be, instead of turning to those communities and expecting them to be patient, with you to explain things to you during this time is go educate yourself. You know, like honestly, white people need to be having these conversations in their own communities. It really doesn't. It shouldn't involve people of color, right? It's not our responsibility to sit there and be patient with you. And if people are impatient, it's not a reflection of them being angry at you, but more of a reflection of this is something that has been so hurtful.
Yeah, it's exhausting, right?
Yeah, it's exhausting. It's like, you know, I mean, I can't even imagine sitting, like going through a trauma and then having to sit there in front of the person who committed that trauma against you, committed that act against you that caused that trauma, and to be calm, right? Yeah. You know what I mean? That's what it feels like, I think, sometimes for people. And so certainly there are spaces where communication, you know, when people are more comfortable, could be, you know, more calm or whatever. But I think that you can't go into it as somebody who's trying to learn, as the oppressor. Going into it, I don't think that you can have that expectation, to be honest. Yeah. I think that it's not fair. And I think that if you're not ready to be uncomfortable and have those conversations in a way where the other person doesn't feel like they have to be there to make you, you know, feel more comfortable, then have those conversations in your own space.
Yeah.
There's so much out there to educate yourself, right? So anyway, I mean, that's
cool. I appreciate that counterpoint. Thank you. Do you have any new creative projects in the pipeline outside of your medical responsibilities?
I was thinking about writing a new book. I also just kind of I do a lot of portraits that, so I don't think I have them up on my website yet, but that's kind of the next phase. But that's something that I've been wanting to put out there. And yeah, once in a while I get the itch to do some creative writing. But yeah, I think lately I've been a little drained.
Totally. Yeah, you know, that's totally cool to give yourself a break, focus on you a little bit. Right. Is there anything concrete that you're actively kind of like, you feel like you could level up on as just a person that you're working on? I mean, that you're comfortable sharing?
Like that I'm doing creatively right now?
Or just anything, like yoga or breathing just anything.
Oh yeah, I just finished. I've been reading a lot, so I have a reading goal for 2021.
Oh, nice.
I'm the type of person where, because my field is so scientific, that I hate reading nonfiction. It's just not. I don't need more education right now. So I love fiction. Novels are definitely my thing. And so I think my goal this year is only like 10 books or something. So I just read a little bit before bed. But I just finished Pachinko. I don't know if you've read that.
The way my brain works, it's like impossible for me to finish a book.
No, Terrence. Yeah. He always makes fun of me because he says, "Oh, when you read, you just like go places," and I was just like, "Yeah, it's like watching a movie in my head." You know? So, I think doing that, I should be better about exercising. I think that would be really important for everybody, and so we are in LA, you know,
I'm right there with you.
Yeah, exactly. Man, it's hard though. It's so hard, but. Yeah, I really should be better about that. I encourage everybody to do a little bit more activity. I need to take my own advice that I give to patients.
You heard the doc.
Yes. and a meditation practice, I think, is also super important. There's so much free stuff right now because of COVID.
Yeah.
The focus on mental health is awesome, but meditation has so many benefits. I also could be better about that.
I use a free app that's very it's pretty casual. It doesn't make you feel intimidated. And it's called Oak.
Oh,
and it just helps me with breathing and meditation. And it's so not intimidating. And I recommend it because it's free.
Yeah. Insight Timer is another one that's totally free. it's not very structured, which I think for some people can be a little bit difficult, but it is totally free.
Yeah, I kind of like that unstructured thing, so I'll look into it.
Yeah, look into it. And it's cool because it has like all these like chants and like gongs and stuff. It reminds me of when I used to go to temple with my mom.
Yeah, sometimes that sound like kind of brings you back here.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
So you do so much stuff and you're very productive, and it takes so much discipline, I think, to have such diverse responsibilities, from raising a child to like doing your medical work and then doing all your side projects and actually just like being a human, washing dishes and laundry and stuff. I've been kind of struggling balancing everything and having to kind of just shut one thing down so that I can take care of everything else. Mm-hmm. Do you have a hot tip or a life hack that you can share with me about kind of just staying consistent and, you know, not falling off the horse?
Yeah. I would say I have to do the same thing. There's only so many hours in a day, right? And so I think for me, it's really been about prioritizing the things that are important to me. Work is actually really important to me, and I get a lot of joy out of work. And so I go home and I still do certain things, but I do have my boundaries, right? Like I don't like when people call me after hours.
Yeah.
And so I don't have a problem setting boundaries. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is kind of along those lines, is having the insight to know that you can't do everything. Like we're not superhumans. I barely cook anymore. I love cooking, but I barely cook anymore. I just don't have the time. And it's one of those things where I'm just like, you know what, instead of coming home and spending an hour making dinner, I'd rather spend an hour with my daughter because I don't see her that much. And if that means ordering out, then, you know, so be it. And I think being kind to yourself, I think that we just have so many, we're really hard on ourselves. And I think even just what you said, like you feel like you're not disciplined enough, but like, I don't think that me going home and not being able to cook for my family has anything to do with discipline. And it took me a while to kind of get to that point, right? Like, and I was just like, you have limits. Everybody has limits. Everybody has boundaries. And again, there's only enough hours in the day. So be kind to yourself. And for me, it's hiring a nanny. If you're privileged enough to be able to do those things, you know, recognize that, but then also it's okay. It's okay to do that. But then finally, I think kind of all the things that we talked about is that like investing 5 minutes of self-care into your day, it is really investment because you get back so much from it. And I think just going all day, I recognized at work, between work and everything and building this new clinic, at some point I was just really spread thin. And, you know, I have the insight that, but then also I have great coworkers who are like, hey, like you need to cut back a little bit. And so I did. And I don't feel bad about it, you know? So you just have to know yourself, know your limits, listen to your body, listen to your mental health and make changes. I think that's the most important part, is not only just recognizing those things, but then letting yourself and being and forgiving yourself enough to just make those changes and do what's good for you. I
love that. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know how concrete it was, but
take care of yourselves, everybody.
Exactly.
Dr. Cate Lay, thank you so much for joining me for Coffee with BAO. It's been such a great conversation, and you have such great insights, and I'm really stoked to be able to share all of this to people.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been really fun.
Dr. Cate Lay's book is called Coronavirus is Boo Boo. You can find her at Cate Lay MD, CATELEMD.com. And then you can find her book at coronavirusisbooboo.com. And this is like episode 25. I can't believe that. If you've been digging this show, these conversations, these guests, please support me by subscribing and sharing this with your peeps. I would really appreciate that. And also, if you can financially support me in making all of this content, that would be super cool. You can do so at coffeewithbao.com. Thank you for joining me and Cate. We will see you later.